Hello and welcome to Talk About Jazz with Doug Hall. I'm your host, Doug Hall. And today we have a guest who is both a drummer, composer, and band leader, and involved in many other projects. We have Phil Haynes with us today. And welcome, Phil.
Greetings.
Thank you.
So great to be on.
I'm going to go ahead and cover just a brief introduction of your career, which won't be all-encompassing, but I feel it's important to acknowledge the credits of individual jazz artists. So once again, as jazz drummer, composer, and band leader, you've had collaborations with many of seminal musicians of this generation. I have saxophonist Anthony Braxton. Ellery is at Eskelin.
Yes.
And David Liebman, of course, legendary saxophone player. Trumpeters Thomas Heberer, Robertson and Paul Smoker. Bassist Mark Dresser, Ken Filiano and Drew Gress. Keyboard artist David Kikoski and Denman Kikoski and Denman Maroney and Michelle Rosewoman. Vocalist Theo Bleckmann, Nicholas Homer, and Hank Roberts, and finally, violinist Mark Feldman. I also
Not a bad starting point, huh?
So in addition to those credits, you are featured on more than 85 releases from numerous American and European record labels, and also a part of a composers collective called Joint Venture.
Yes.
And your outlets include several bands of different genre styles. We have the Romantic Jazz Grass String Band, Free Country. I have the saxophone trio, No Fast Food. The classic piano trio, Daydream, featuring Steve Rudolph. And finally, your solo project, Sanctuary.
That's right.
All right.
And
that covers a lot of ground.
Have some new. Yeah, it does cover some ground, and I also have new trios with two of the trumpet players you mentioned, and that's Thomas Heberer with Ken Filiano, and also Herb Robertson with Ken Filiano. Two separate trios, one electrified and one all acoustic, and man, do we have fun.
Good. Wow, well, that's a full plate. So again, welcome and thank you for connecting with us. We're obviously going to cover some ground here today in 30 minutes, and if we go over, that's okay. Your musical background, your musical directions, and more specifically, we'll talk about your recent recording project with your jazz trio, No Fast Food, and the release of Codas with the S in parentheses in June of this year, which is, I believe, if I have this correctly, the first of several planned musical projects through 2025.
Yes, we're letting it all hang out here.
Wow. Well, we're going to try to cover ground here, and I thought I would start out with kind of backing up to where you were when you really began your musical career, talking a bit about your musical background and your early development as a jazz drummer. I mean, could you touch on that a bit?
Yeah, you bet. My first jazz recordings, I begged my parents, for drum lessons for about 9 or 10 years. And family lore has me assembling pots and pans and Lincoln logs and whatever, and playing with the hi-fi, when I was less than 2 years old. And it hasn't changed. It really hasn't. And when I was in, I think it was fifth grade, so 1971, that'll date me. New records that came out. I finally got drum lessons with this hip young guy from Pacific University which was in my hometown. I got to study with him, and he was a student there from San Francisco. And so he introduced me to, all at the same time, Tower of Power, Buddy Rich, and Elvin Jones.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah, right? And those records all arrived Christmas 1971 or 72.
Okay.
And Buddy Rich's live at Ronnie Scott's, live in London, amazing. And I was able to start playing with that immediately, playing the skeleton rhythm to the opener, which Rock Beat 1A actually works. I could play along with it even though I couldn't even begin to decode, his virtuosic mastery.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And, Tower of Power, I couldn't play along with very easily because it was so funky to start with. But I got there shortly because I had a great teacher. And, of course, I was listening to Master Garibaldi. And then there's Elvin Jones, and I put this on. And that album, by the way, featured Merry-Go-Round, featured none other than David Liebman on almost on every track. And Chick Corea makes appearances on that, and I think it's his first recording of of La Fiesta.
Okay.
And man, this record is just brilliant. It is one of my favorites to this day. And what's fascinating, I asked Lieb about it when it was, it's like pretty much my first record was studio record with Elvin, and I just joined his band and whatever. And I said, this is just amazing, but it was so dark, and I just had never heard anything like it. And of course, completely mystified by the drumming and the grooves, and I couldn't play anything along with it. So I would listen to it multiple times every year and come back to it religiously. It was a ritual to come back.
Right.
And about 10 years later, I come back from my first semester at Coe College, where I met Paul Smoker, and all of a sudden, of course, with, a semester with Paul, I could hear it. It just, because my favorite thing to do is I put my headphones on, in the basement and, with my drum set and start playing immediately to records or the radio. And as a matter of fact, as soon as I'd get off the plane, I'd stop on the way back home, at the used record store in Portland, Django's, and I would buy everything, everything with Miles on it that I could find, everything with Coltrane on it, of course, everything with Elvin on it, and so on and so forth. And guess what? There's David Liebman keeps popping up, and
sure.
Isn't it amazing? 1972 to 2022 when we recorded this last record, Codas, and it's 50 years. He's been in my head.
That's amazing.
And in my ears. And who would have thunk that I could end up playing with a guy on a record that mystified me for a decade?
Well,
that's clearly...
wonderful and formidable, and quite...
formidable. You got it, man.
Yeah. Wow. Well, look, I'm going to take you forward to Pennsylvania and 2003 and your relationship with Bucknell University. I have some notes here related to the founding of a nationally noted jazz chamber series called Jazz at Bucknell. And you've been a musical educator there. You've developed ensembles, obviously taught. Could you talk a little bit about that period of your life and your ongoing connection with Bucknell University?
Absolutely. Let's see where to start. We skipped over New York City. So, 4 years with Paul in Iowa, and then I went straight to New York City for 20 some years. And that's where, of course,
well,
you make all your connections.
We can back that up because actually, funny enough, I had that as a following question. So,
well, good, but we'll come back to it.
We'll come back to that next.
I made my career, but I also noticed toward the end of my 20 plus years in New York City, I also noticed that it's like as successful as I had been artistically, and it was clear, that was working out. And the recordings, attested to that, and all the guys in the corner store community, whether it was Dave Douglas or Drew Gress or Herb Robertson or Ellery Eskelin or Tim Byrne or you name it, right? Let alone Paul Smoker, all these people, and we, they're Ben Monder, they're all household names now in Europe, right? They all succeeded, and one of the things that happened was I was getting dark at that time, right around 2000, and feeling like, man, maybe my ship isn't ever going to come in, and I don't want to be dark. I noticed some people I really respected had gotten dark in the media, and let it out that they were frustrated. Masters,
Sure.
And it was like, oh, I don't want to ever be like that. And so I realized, hey, I'm supporting my music to do anything that I want, which I did, right, by painting and plastering high-end apartments in New York City. Well, I can do the same thing in Lewisburg. I don't, and I can still come to New York City. It's just a couple hours away. So I moved, and of course, I soon ended up painting and plastering the historic Bucknell President's House, and who should be coming in but a new president, Brian Mitchell, and I ended up being the last painter on the job because he had, it was an old house without closets, and so furniture was made for him, closets and whatever, and so I finished the stuff for him. We talked about everything. So I never brought up to, the new president that I was a musician.
Okay.
Fast forward 9 months, and Dee and I are coming out of a restaurant, and Brian and his wife Mary Jane are coming into a restaurant, and we talk like old friends for 10 minutes in the hallway, in the foyer, and they keep asking us to sit down with them and whatever. Finally, we sat down with them and had some more wine. Dee said something, and Brian said, "Oh, I didn't know you two were musicians." And she says, "Oh, well, I'm just an amateur musician, but Phil's an internationally, recognized percussionist, and composer, and leader." And he was like, "You're kidding." And 20 minutes later, I had a $35,000 a year series, Jazz at Bucknell, established, and I said,
Wow.
"You let me bring in." I said, "You're just in a great place. You're a half a day drive from New York City. With $35,000, I can put on 6 to 8 concerts a year. There's no backline. Guys come and they set up, they play acoustically in this great hall we have with this great piano, and next thing you know, it's still going on today."
I'm going to kind of let you summarize a bit of your New York City experience, which, funny enough, was my second question. And I'd left with a broader question that if you can manage your way around this. Being as you've been a musician working in the performance scene and the nightclub scene in New York City, when you round out the end of your answer, if you could just touch on how has that world, the jazz scene, changed in New York City from when you began to where it is now? So I'll let you.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to make it too broad with the time that we have.
It's a great question. Let me say, Paul Smoker, I would say, gosh, can't we get, this would be in the 80s, the early 80s.
Yep.
Gee, can't we get more for this gig? He says, man, 20 years ago, it was $100 a gig. It's still $100 a gig.
Wow.
And it's 20 years later. And he says, 20 years ago, I could buy a good steak dinner, for $6. And he says, I've ordered a custom, custom Chevy, and it was $3,500 made for me. And he says, that you can't, he says, what? It's 4 times, those costs are 4 times now. Right. That was in the 80s. And of course, it stayed that way. I got out here to Iowa, to New York. It's $100 a gig if you're lucky, unless you're playing club dates, playing wedding bands, right? Which means you can't play what you want to necessarily. And now it's door gigs, or guys are, the transition happened where you're either playing for the door, you're no longer, guaranteed enough, to bring in a band, or you're helping to fund it by, in New York, basically, if I play a free gig, I'm playing, pure improv, with friends I want to play with, oh yeah, I'll take a share of the door. That's fine. If I'm playing standards, I'll do the same thing if there's no guarantee. But as soon as I'm playing somebody else's music, I need to be paid, right? As soon as there's rehearsals, I need to be paid. Right. And likewise, I do the same for other people. Anthony Braxton taught Paul and taught myself this. It's like, oh yeah, I take very little. The leader's fee, I put right back into the band and make sure they're all taken care of, so that as difficult as the music and the business and the travel might be, it's always business. It's never personal.
Sure. Okay.
You get better performances that way, which is what I always did with my recordings. it was like, well, we didn't do demo recordings. We did it for real. And everybody plays different, which is interesting because psychologically you're different. Well, now there's, I used to get, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, I would get my usual check from BMI, $1,000, $1,500, $300 every year, right, for all my compositions that are out and getting played on records, especially in Europe and whatever. And, then streaming came in and CDs and record companies contracted. I haven't seen a check in 20 years.
Right.
Because of the streaming reality. So now, that's what we're dealing with. So now everybody, even somebody like, Jason Moran, who, records for Blue Note, also has his own Bandcamp where he puts out the things that he self-produces and self-pays for, right? And does it himself, whether there are physical copies available or not. I mean, everybody, the good thing about all this is that musicians and artists have taken back the reins of control so that when your record goes out of print, it's not out of public accessibility, right? And that's what used to happen. You'd sell your master tapes for less than what they cost to a fine European boutique label or whatever. It would come out, and 3 years later, it's sold out, the 1,000, 1,500, 15,000 copies, right? Whatever it was, they're sold out, and now it's out of print. And then those companies, so many of them ended up going bankrupt when the industry changed 20 years ago. Right. And so now you don't own your rights anymore.
Right. Unbelievable.
So people, artists said, hey, this isn't worth it. I only sold 2 projects and then 3 projects, I guess. And then I realized this isn't working for me. It's going out of print and out of availability, and this music is lasting. And so I started doing long-term leases with companies. Right. And that worked. And then, of course, the Bandcamp phenomenon came here in the last 5-10 years. Right. And I finally have managed to build my Bandcamp so that I'm making, the lunch money that I was on tour selling hard copies, I now sell every year on Bandcamp by people being attracted.
Right. Well, clearly the audience listening and really the larger audience of music listeners aren't aware of how, the reality of making a living in jazz. I'm reminded of a phrase I heard from a nightclub owner, and this goes way back. The old joke was, how do you make $1 million in jazz? You start with 5. Right, you've heard it, right? There's different variations.
No, keep going.
Right. How do you make $1 million in jazz? You start with 5 million.
Yeah, there you go. That's like the jazz musicians that won the lottery, and people said, "Well, what are you going to do with the money?" He said, "I'm going to keep working until it's gone."
Right. That's a better punch to it because it takes you a minute to get that to say, "Oh, ouch." Well, look, in the interest of time here, I'm going to move forward to your most recent release of Codas by your trio No Fast Food. And we have 2 cuts to play, and I'm first going to play Beloved Refracted, which is a quieter tune, and then we'll follow with a little Iowa Get Down, which is more
great.
energized.
Sure. Yes, a little Iowa Get Down is what No Fast Food. This is our 3rd record together.
Your 3rd record,
and my
together.
4th with Liebman.
Okay.
And by that group, and my 4th with Liebman overall. And a little Iowa Get Down is what people expect No Fast Food to do. It's energized, crazy. We have a great time.
Got it.
And Beloved Refracted is the kind of coda that this band is involved with because Dave is in his late period. Mm-hmm. And this was the kind of music that was magical last December when we recorded. Okay. Anyway, Beloved Refracted is it's a piece written for my wife based on the letters of her name, Deanne Castile.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. The intro helps with that, as the piece is quiet and reflective and thoughtful. So we'll begin with Beloved Refracted, and we'll just listen to maybe like a minute and a half and then fade out. And if you want to say a few words about the piece, that's fine, and I might reflect upon it. And then we will go into a little Iowa Get Down. Wow, what a very meditative piece. I've listened to it several times, and it sinks in a little bit deeper when I'm able to listen to it quietly, as each instrument seems to be on its own sort of like meditative narrative. It's very soft but very emotional.
Yes, thanks. I noticed Coltrane's Ballads record.
Yes.
Okay. How this true romance and quiet and calm was so affecting, even with his classic quartet. And I've always felt that beyond quartets, boy, if you can play trios have this amazing ability that each person can be doing their own thing, right? Completely their own thing,
Mm-hmm.
and yet. If you have it right and they're sensitive, right? Those three separate pieces of information are more than the sum of their parts, and people can hear it. We know from psychological studies that people can keep track of those three things. Once you get to four and more, fewer and fewer people can.
Good observation. Right. So the focus can remain on three.
Yeah. And trios have always been, and duos,
Mm-hmm.
but trios have always been the magic in my career, whether it was Paul Smoker's trio, right, or the trios I have now with Thomas Heberer and Herb Robertson, or, this trio,
Mm-hmm.
No Fast Food. I keep coming back to trios or piano trios, the same thing. It's like, the drummer, me,
Mm-hmm.
everybody has all this freedom so that you don't just have to be required. Once you go to quartet and quintet, rhythm sections tend to become more and more traditional.
Sure.
Or they fall into roles instead of being more expansive, because other people have to have room for them. Whereas in a trio, everybody can be quite expressive, and it'll hold the magic.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many examples. I'm almost thinking of how I listened to an older Bill Evans release where he was recorded in Europe, and there they were, and it was just so intense because of what he's doing on the piano, but also what the bassist and the drummer is doing. It was just amazing. And
it's interesting you bring up Bill Evans, because his bassist that was the first revolutionary one back, in the early '60s, right,
Mm-hmm.
and Scott LaFaro is the prototype for someone like Drew Gress and all the bassists who have come after Scott.
Right.
And if you notice on that first piece, and again with A Little Iowa Get Down, Drew is the one who's playing the head.
Yes.
Not, well, I'm having Dave improvise.
Right.
And you just you can effectively turn over the predisposition and the preconceptions of what a trio is.
Yes.
And create this collective identity where anybody can be the principal at any time. Mm-hmm. And it's a welcome area, and it starts with that trio, Bill Evans' trio, way back when. And now we're, you go 50, 60, 70 years later, and it's really coming to fruition.
Yeah. Well, let's move to the next composition, A Little Iowa Get Down. And let's have a listen, and then I look forward to your response, and certainly I may have some reaction as well.
Counting on it, Doug.
So, wow, that has such a swing and groove to it. And again, as we were just talking about bassists being kind of playing ahead, you certainly hear the lead off there, and the takeoff on the saxophone with Liebman that just kind of soars the piece and makes it sing.
Catching the big wave, didn't he?
Catching the big wave on top of the wave.
Yeah, Lieb was riding the wave, man. He was just having a great time.
Wow. So do you want to make
and
any...
This is the tradition, Doug, that this band comes from. Right after Elvin left Coltrane in the mid-'60s, after Rashid had joined the band, and it just didn't work out for... It might have been working out for Coltrane, but it wasn't working out for Elvin.
Got it.
And so he left the band, and for, I think, 6 weeks or so, he was with Ellington. But then he started his trio, and he had this great trio. And those couple of records that he put out in the late 60s, I had never heard saxophone, bass, drums trio before that. Then I realized, there's Sonny Rollins' Way Out West. This isn't quite so, it's not so revolutionary. But of course, with Elvin Jones, it is revolutionary. And of course, it's now post-Coltrane instead of pre-Coltrane, so it's revolutionary. And I just remember his relatively simple heads just exploding into these waves like the one that you just heard Liebman grab. And then, of course, Liebman is hearing this stuff, and his recordings with Elvin happened just after that. And so no fast food when I wanted to do a trio so that I could get back to Europe and have something more compact and more explosive than, say, my quintet, four horns and what. And whatever that had been there, or my quartet continuum with Mark Feldman that had been there, times. It was like, something more compact, something more explosive even for me, and something that I can afford. Right?
Sure.
Well, it just turned out that the few offers I would get, they weren't offering me enough not to lose money. And it's like, I would say to them, Liebman plays your festival, Drew plays your festival, both as leaders and all-star bands and sidemen. I know what you pay. And they said, we'd rather have those bands.
Sure. Well,
if you want to lose money, you just go ahead and we'll put you on the stage because it's more than good enough.
Right.
I said, you don't have to tell me that.
Right. You've been living that world for a long time, as we've just discussed. Right. So
it's one thing to put your money into a recording, live or studio, and to understand that ECM or Blue Note or whoever, Columbia, you're not going to have a chance with yet. Right. You haven't been at the right place at the right time. Right. The introduction hasn't been made. Right. But it's a whole other thing to already have your records out, already have a band with multiple records, already have a band with all-stars, and not get booked for money you have to have.
God, madness. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our talk, but obviously this could go on for quite a long time, and we'll see about circling around later on. But I wanted to make sure that I told our listeners that you have a lot of different projects going forward, and briefly, you have an autobiography, Chasing the Masters, which is due out November of 23. You're accompanying that with a career-spanning 62-track audio compilation entitled A Life Improvised. So there is a lot going on in your life musically right now, and I want our listeners certainly to follow on that with the websites that are indicated. And thank you so much, Phil. Again, we covered some territory, and we just couldn't cover all of it. But
never.
It's been a wonderful...
That's a good thing.
That's a good thing. We'd be here till midnight, but wonderful to have just an open conversation with you, and thank you so much for participating and being a part of this broadcast and Talk About Jazz with Doug Hall. And I wish you all the best with particularly all the variety of projects ahead of you.
Thank you so much. Onward and upward, Doug.
Absolutely. You take care, Phil. Thank you again.
Ciao.